Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Simon Gertzen. You're watching Sam Says at MTGOacademy.com, and today I'm going to show you another Return to Ravnica draft I did. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the deeper concepts that are showing up in this limited format. This episode is titled The Toughness Barrier because that's exactly what I want to talk about. Now, when we think of a toughness barrier in limited, this is basically the sweet spot, the power that your creatures have to reach to be able to push through damage to prevent the game from going into a ground or board stall. And the easiest way to do that is to make your creatures stronger than what your opponent has, and that usually means that if you want to be on the offensive side, you want the power of your creatures to be at least as high as the toughness of the defenders, and vice versa. If you're on the defensive, you want your toughness of your creatures to be higher than the power of your opponent's attacking creatures. Now, what was mentioned really early on and noted just from the spoiler was the high number of 4 toughness creatures in Return to Ravnica. So this is a number that varies in each format, but in Return to Ravnica it's definitely 4 toughness, and that's the barrier you have to reach because your attacking creatures are going to have 2, sometimes 3 power, but very rarely do you get a 4 powered creature in this format. There are rares and some uncommons, of course, but a 4 power attacking creature at common is going to have some serious disadvantages as well. Now, this is just an example of the defensive creatures available to the colors or guilds if you want, and we can see that all the colors have means to protect themselves. We're starting with Azorius, moving over to Izzet, which has quite a few defensive options, and of course the hover barrier being another one of them. So black doesn't have all that many defensive cards, and that's because Rakdos wants to be aggressive, and Gorgari has Scavenge to make all creatures bigger in the long run. And we see a pretty even distribution of 4 toughness creatures, except for in Selesnya, and that's because Selesnya is the 3/3 color, positioned just barely below the toughness barrier, and it has other ways to circumvent that problem because 3/3s can just run into for all of these 4 toughness creatures, almost all of them. It makes it possible to play either a strategy of populating so many creatures onto the battlefield that it doesn't matter that your opponent has some blockers, or alternatively using some of the many Selesnya base spells to push through damage and to punish your opponent's blocking decisions. So what are the spells that Return to Ravnica offers us to actually get beyond that hover barrier? I already talked about the Selesnya colored cards, and Giant Growth and Swift Justice being the 1 mana options to get a 3/3 or something smaller beyond one of these high toughness creatures. Common Bond being extremely potent on the aforementioned centaurs or other Selesnya creatures because you can make one creature strong enough, sometimes even 2 creatures exactly strong enough to make to really swing the board position in your favor. Now, green has been known for having all these combat tricks, and these combat tricks aren't available to the other guilds. Now, when you look at the remaining cards, your first instinct from basically any limited format would be that most of these are pretty bad. We've seen Trader's Instinct or cards like that be very effective in very aggressive strategies and in formats where there's a common sack outlet like Bloodthorn Vampire, but it's not usually a card you would consider to be very good. Also, it's not really a way to push through to power up your creatures, but you'd rather like steal one of your opposing creatures. So I guess that one doesn't really count at all. Now, we see that the Rakdos deck, which is quite aggressive, has almost no serious ways to make their creatures larger apart from unleashing. After you unleash, your creatures usually have 2 or 3 power, so you need 1 more power to get through um, the defensive options of your opponent. And we see that Deviant Glee is, well, it's a subtle thing, but it's actually a better Unholy Strength, and it's in the Rakdos colors. It's exactly the card that Rakdos wants and needs to push through damage. And this is a theme that continues here. We have Pursuit of Flight looking like it's really not that great, a worse Spectral Flight if you want, but even if you don't play islands, you can put it in your Rakdos deck as a bad Volcanic Strength and just go to town with the creature you suited up. And that's particularly important if you have a 3-power creature, which you make into a 5/5. Not only does it get past these 4 toughness defenders, it also kills your opponent in 4 swings. So the clock management, the time you need to kill your opponent, is also a very important part of this. Now, these combat tricks here on the right side aren't usable for Selesnya decks, which means that, well, except for Swift Justice, which doesn't really always help if you are playing Azorius creatures, which have 2 power, and Swift Justice is not enough to run into a 4 toughness creature. So what you want is cards that allow you to give your creatures at least +2/+2 and possibly more. So the 2 cards that do that are Knightly Valor and Ethereal Armor, as long as you have another enchantment under your control. So the way this format is set up, with relatively few unconditional removal spells, not that many instant removal spells, and a lot of high toughness, a lot of defensive creatures, if you want to be on the offensive, which I still think is the thing you want to do, then you are going to need cards to push through damage in basically all the guilds if you aren't playing the very defensive strategy yourself. And what we've seen, I mean, this isn't I'm not telling you a secret or something that's completely new, but we see cards like Deviant Glee, Pursuit of Flight, Ethereal Armor, and Knightly Valor rise in value over the course of this format's exploration. So Knightly Valor has been called a very good card pretty quickly, and I agree with that assessment completely. I still think it's important in the Azorius deck and not so much in the Selesnya deck, because the Selesnya deck already has a lot of options of pushing through damage and is very susceptible to bounce effects and instant removal in a way. So playing another expensive aura is not what the Selesnya deck wants to do primarily. It's going to do it if needed, but Knightly Valor for me is clearly an Azorius card. And so is Ethereal Armor. If you're playing Selesnya, you want tokens, you want populate, you want instants, and you need a creature base, of course. So putting all these auras and enchantments into your deck just dilutes your game plan. So especially because the cards that make Ethereal Armor better, well, first of all, more Ethereal Armors, but then cards like Security Blockade and some of the blue auras available are basically Azorius cards. So overall, you have a Dyna Charge, I didn't talk about that, which is as good in a Swarm strategy or combined with First Strike. But if we are talking about pushing through, then you usually want something more than just giving a creature +2/+0. So all of this is basically the reason why we see these auras become more and more important for everybody that's not playing green. Green has alternatives in Scavenge and these great combat tricks, but if you're playing Rakdos, you should be playing Deviant Glees, you should be playing Pursuit of Flights, and you don't have to be ashamed for playing Traitorous Instincts and or Dyna Charges. If you're playing Izzet, you might want to go for a very controlling strategy, but there are cards that want to be attacking, and in Magic and in Limited in general, trying to be controlling only has its downsides, making a creature 4/4 flying or even larger has merits offensively and defensively, giving you more options during combat and putting some pressure on your opponent, which reduces his options or his ability to play all his turns optimally just from his perspective. And last but not least, we have Azorius, and that's, I think, the big thing to take away here. Azorius is not a defensive deck. It does have the Void Wielder and it does have Detain, but when you think about it, it also has all the evasion. And when is Detain at its best? It's really at its best if you're using it first to get push through more damage, and then to take less damage as a result of Detain still working after you've passed your turn. So if you want to maximize what your Detain cards do, you actually want to be on the offensive rather than just using it to delay the inevitable. So I think this look at the toughness barrier and how to break it in Return to Ravnica Limited has shown you some interesting things, but there might be one or two things in the draft that relate to what I just talked about. Enjoy the show. See you next time.